You weren't just a custodian, not just a woman pushing dented trash bins across the asphalt, ignored by cadets who barely saw you pass. At least that's what they thought as they laughed behind your back, calling you bin girl, like the name was all you were ever going to be. But what they didn't know was that once, under a different name, entire operations had waited on your silence. Entire units had trusted your eyes in the dark, and one morning it all cracked open when the base shook under a drill that was no drill at all, and a single voice broke the chaos with words no one expected. Obsidian Glass, fall in. Before I tell you how the ground shifted that day, if you agree that honor doesn't end when the uniform comes off, like and subscribe, because this story is one that deserves to be remembered. Her name was Clara Hensley, late 20s, younger than most, expected to find hauling trash cans outside the barracks. Her hair tied back, her boots scuffed with work instead of parade shine, her jacket stitched at the elbows where fabric had worn thin, but her movements carried something strange, too sharp, too exact for someone just working maintenance. She walked the line of bins like she was measuring the perimeter, checking their placement with the kind of precision that made a private hesitate and look twice, even if he didn't know why. To the recruits who joked, she was nothing more than a failed story. Too young to be retired, too old to be starting fresh. A woman who had somehow landed where no one wanted to be. Better hope the garbage doesn't revolt, or she'll be the only one to save us. One lieutenant laughed, his voice carrying across the yard while his friend snickered. Clara didn't turn her head, didn't offer a glare, didn't even slow down as she gripped the steel handle of the bin and dragged it into line. Silence was her answer. The same silence she'd given in briefing rooms years earlier when officers twice her age demanded reports she'd already prepared. She'd learned then that words were wasted when the room wasn't listening. That silence unsettled one cadet, Private Morales, who noticed how Clara always paused before entering the yard, scanning rooftops and fence lines like someone waiting for patterns to reveal themselves. She had the look of someone who wasn't pushing bins but patrolling. And though Morales couldn't explain it, something in her stillness reminded him of his father's stories about veterans who never really came home, who carried the war in how they stood, not in what they said. What Clara carried, no one knew, because she never told them. Not the 5 tours that had left scars she never showed. Not the code name whispered in ops rooms like a shadow. Obsidian Glass. Not the time she refused extraction until every man under her had crossed the river alive. To the base, she was invisible. To herself, she was watchful. She carried the weight of being dismissed, of being mocked by lieutenants who thought volume was leadership, of being a silhouette pushing garbage while inside her chest the instincts of a soldier never slept. Every morning, the ritual was the same. Arrive before sunrise, bins rattling in the still dark, coffee cooling in a paper cup she rarely touched, her eyes shifting not toward her work, but toward the places most people didn't bother looking. The fence, the corners of the yard, the gaps in lighting no one fixed. And every morning the laughter followed her, small jokes whispered just loud enough, smirks traded across the benches as if daring her to respond. But Clara had no interest in being seen. She wasn't there for their approval. She was there because silence gave her what she wanted. Time to watch, time to prepare, time to remember who she had been and who she still was when no one believed. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon and the yard filled with the chatter of cadets heading to chow, Clara bent to line up the last bin. Lieutenant Avery, a rising star known for his swagger, paused. With a smirk. Careful, bin girl, don't strain yourself. Leave the heavy lifting to those of us who actually serve. A chorus of laughter rose around him. Clara straightened slowly, dusted her hands, and gave him a single look. Not angry, not wounded, just steady. For the first time, Avery's grin faltered. Something in those eyes told him the joke wasn't as safe as he thought. He turned away quickly, muttering, "Whatever," as if to reclaim control, but the unease lingered. Clara moved on, no words wasted, no fight taken. And still, Morales kept watching, wondering why a woman in her 20s seemed older than any man he'd trained beside, why her silence felt like preparation, not weakness. That night, as the barracks lights flickered and the compound settled into its rhythm, Clara sat alone in the utilities shed, a notebook open in front of her. The pages weren't about trash schedules or maintenance locks. They were maps, fence layouts, light cycles, guard rotations. Lines drawn with the precision of someone who had never stopped calculating risks. She closed it before anyone could see, slipped it back into the canvas bag she kept by her side, and leaned back in the chair. The laughter outside drifted in, muffled through the thin walls, but she let it pass. They thought she was invisible. That was fine. They thought she had nothing left. That was safer, because one day, soon, they would find out what silence had been guarding all along. And when the base shook, when the system faltered, when chaos spilled where order was supposed to hold, they would learn the name she thought she had buried forever. Obsidian Glass. And it would not be whispered this time. It would be called out. It began with a sound so small most people ignored it. The brief crackle of radios cutting out mid-report, a stuttering whine from the security gates as if the power grid had swallowed its breath. But Clara Hensley heard it, and unlike the others, she did not dismiss it as a glitch. She straightened from the row of bins she'd been dragging along the yard, her hand tightening on the steel handle, eyes snapping toward the perimeter fence. The early morning light stretched thin across the compound, catching the nervous shuffle of recruits as they realized their comms weren't working, their drills suspended in confused silence. Lieutenant Avery's voice broke the uncertainty like a web. "Stay in formation. It's just interference, nothing more." His tone was sharp, commanding, but Clara heard the edge of doubt beneath it. She dropped the bin where it stood and walked with steady steps toward the far side of the yard, her gaze narrowing on a patch of ground where grass bent in the wrong direction, too fresh, too deliberate to be the wind. By the time she reached the fence, the compound was beginning to unravel. Recruits looked to one another for direction. Officers barked conflicting orders, and the alarms that should have been blaring stayed eerily silent. Clara crouched low, brushing her fingers against the dirt, tracing a shallow indentation no one else would have noticed. Footprints, civilian, deliberate, moving in pairs. She exhaled, calm but certain. The drill wasn't a drill anymore. She rose, turned her head just enough, and spoke into the nearest security handset that had somehow flickered back to life for a moment. Her words were clipped, precise, like muscle memory pulling the truth from her. Sector 6 compromised. Two-man team. Moving low. Adjust formations. The voice on the other end. Young, panicked, hesitated. Who is this? Maintenance doesn't have clearance. But her words carried with them something steadier than any clearance code. Authority earned, not granted. The line went silent before static swallowed it again. Across the yard, Avery was red-faced now, shouting at recruits to tighten ranks, blaming faulty equipment, insisting no breach existed. No confirmation. Probably squirrels, he barked, forcing laughter to hide the crack forming in his command. But as he spoke, Clara kept moving, her boots sure against the gravel, her eyes locked on the southeast quadrant where the shadows lay too still, too heavy. Private Morales, watching from the edge of formation, felt his stomach twist. He remembered those eyes from his father's stories, the way real soldiers never wasted words because they were too busy seeing what others missed. He stepped out of line, ignoring Avery's barked rebuke, and followed Clara at a distance. Then came the rumble, a low vibration that trembled through the concrete as the compound's power grid collapsed. Lights flickered once, twice, then died. Cameras went black. Gates froze midlock. Radios cut into static. For 13 long seconds, the entire base was blind. In that darkness, chaos broke. Recruits stumbled, calling out. Officers scrambled, trying to restore order. Avery's voice cracked as he screamed, "Secure the barracks. Form perimeter. Someone get me a damn status report." But no one could give him one. They were blind, deaf, cut off. And Clara, silent, steady Clara, was already moving toward the breach point she had marked in her notebook weeks before, her hand brushing the chain link as if to confirm what she already knew. Then, through the confusion, headlights appeared. A black SUV rolled into the yard, unhurried, confident, like it had been expected. The doors opened and out stepped a man whose presence silenced the air without effort. A four-star general, his uniform crisp, his bearing unmistakable. He scanned the yard once, taking in the chaos, the flailing officers, the recruits frozen between orders, and then his eyes found Clara, standing at the fence line with her boots planted firm and her gaze locked on the shadows beyond. His voice rang out, Sharp, commanding, undeniable. Obsidian Glass, fall in. The yard froze. Every head turned toward the young woman in the patched jacket, her gloved hand still resting against the fence. Avery blinked, his mouth falling open, confusion flooding his face. Obsidian what? That's just the janitor. But Clara was already moving. She dropped her gloves where she stood, straightened to her full height, and with a precision that needed no rehearsal, she stepped forward and snapped into place before the general. Silence cracked over the compound like thunder. Recruits stared wide-eyed. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Morales felt his chest tighten with vindication. He knew. He'd felt it all along. The general's gaze didn't waver. "Report," he said simply. Clara's voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who had spoken into darker nights than this. Two-man infiltration. Southeast culvert. Coordinated. Testing response times. Compound blind for 13 seconds. Vulnerable sectors locked. She handed him a small notebook, its pages filled with hand-drawn maps, timestamps, and breach intervals recorded with relentless precision. He flipped through quickly, his jaw tightening. Avery stepped forward, indignant. "Sir, this woman has no authority here. She's maintenance, she." The general cut him off with a glare that needed no words. "This woman," he said, his voice like stone, "is Obsidian Glass. Codename retired, not forgotten. She wrote the reconnaissance protocols you're supposed to be following right now. If you had, your compound wouldn't be blind." His words echoed, cold and sharp. Avery's face drained of color. Recruits whispered, the name rippling through the formation like legend suddenly made flesh. Obsidian Glass. Clara didn't bask in the revelation. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the whispers. She simply turned her gaze back to the fence line, her eyes narrowing on the shifting shadows where intruders had already slipped away. "They'll test again," she murmured, half to herself, half to the general. He nodded once. "And when they do," he said, louder now, so every soul in the yard could hear, "they'll find this base is no longer led by arrogance, but by vigilance." Avery tried once more, desperation leaking into his voice. "Sir, I wasn't briefed. No one told me." But the general's reply was a blade. "You weren't told because you weren't listening. She warned you. You dismissed her. And now you'll stand down." The order was final. Avery's protest died in his throat. The recruits, once laughing, now stood straighter, their eyes locked on Clara as she resumed her silent patrol along the perimeter, every step deliberate, every glance a reminder that she had been watching long before any of them noticed. Morales felt a chill run through him as he realized what it meant, that legends didn't always retire in parades or fade into textbooks. Sometimes they pushed trash bins across the yard. Waiting for the day silence was no longer enough. The general raised his voice one last time, addressing the yard. "You've been given a lesson most never live to learn. Respect isn't earned by shouting orders. It's earned by watching, by waiting, by acting when it matters. You saw Obsidian Glass walk among you, unseen, unheard. You mocked her, and she still protected you. Remember this day, because the enemy won't laugh when you fail to see." The compound held its breath, every soul present understanding that something had shifted, that the balance of what they thought they knew had cracked wide open. Clara, steady as ever, walked the fence line with her eyes forward, her silence now heavier than any speech. And though the drills would resume, though the gates would unlock and the lights would flicker back to life, nothing in that yard would ever be the same again. Because once her name was called, once the truth was spoken, no one could ever look at the custodian the same way. She was not invisible anymore. She was Obsidian Glass. The morning after the breach, the compound looked the same. Gates open, lights steady, cadets running drills, but nothing felt the same, because whispers had spread faster than any official report could contain them. Whispers of a woman everyone thought was just a custodian, a woman in patched jackets and scuffed boots who turned out to be Obsidian Glass. And those whispers carried weight, because once a legend's name surfaces, no one forgets it. And while officers tried to reassert order with clipboards and formations, recruits found themselves stealing glances toward Clara Hensley as she moved through the yard, not dragging bins now, but walking the perimeter with the quiet certainty of someone whose silence was sharper than any shouted command. And that afternoon General Harrow returned. Not with fanfare, not with convoys, but alone, his presence enough to draw the entire compound into uneasy stillness. Because when a four-star general walks across gravel without saying a word, people know something is about to change, and he gathered them all in the assembly hall, officers at the back, cadets packed shoulder to shoulder, and when the room quieted, he didn't begin with protocol. He began with a name. Obsidian Glass, he said, voice low but carrying. Some of you mocked her. Some of you dismissed her. All of you overlooked her. Yesterday you learned what it costs when arrogance blinds you to vigilance. His words cut through the air like steel, and then he stepped aside, leaving the podium empty, and the silence was heavier than any command until Clara walked in, not in a decorated uniform, not with medals gleaming, just the same patched jacket and steady boots. And yet the room straightened instinctively, recruits pulling themselves taller, officers stiffening because presence is not stitched on a fabric, it radiates. And when she stopped at the podium, she didn't begin with rank or history. She simply said, I didn't step in yesterday to prove anything. I stepped in because it was my post, and you protect what's in front of you, no matter who laughs, no matter who doubts. That's all service is. That's all it ever was. Her voice was calm, steady, each word carried on the weight of a life lived in shadows. And then she added, eyes scanning the crowd, you think silence means weakness. But silence is choice. Silence is judgment. And when it speaks, it means something. If you want to lead, learn that. Then she closed the notebook she had brought and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, Cadet Morales, trembling but resolute, snapped into a salute, his voice cracking but firm. Man. And like a ripple the entire room followed, hundreds of hands raised in unison, not out of obligation but out of respect that had finally been earned, and Clara paused just long enough to nod before stepping into the hall, leaving the weight of her words behind. In the days that followed, the compound shifted in quiet ways. The laughter that once followed her vanished, replaced by cadets approaching her booth not to mock but to ask questions about patrols, about vigilance, about what it meant to watch without being seen. And she didn't lecture them, didn't tell stories of missions or medals. She just pointed to the fenced line and told them to walk it in silence until they noticed what others missed. And slowly they learned, one by one, that leadership wasn't in shouting drills, but in steady eyes and quiet judgment. Lieutenant Avery tried to reclaim authority with swagger, but the general stripped him of oversight, assigning him to reports and logistics, a punishment masked as paperwork, but understood by everyone as exile from command, and no one envied him. A week later, a new sign appeared at the southeast culvert, hammered into the soil by cadets themselves, Glass Point. They called it, a marker of where Clara had first spotted the breach, where silence had saved them. She didn't ask for it, didn't comment on it, but when she walked past and touched the post lightly with her hand, Morales swore he saw her almost smile. Months passed, and Clara's presence reshaped the culture without speeches or banners. Because recruits began to salute her first, officers paused before dismissing advice, and when she patrolled the yard at dusk, more than one cadet quietly followed, not to guard her, but to learn from the rhythm of her steps, the patience of her gaze. And then one dawn, a ceremony was held, not parade ground pomp, but a gathering at the gate, where a plaque was unveiled. Obsidian Glass. Proof that honor needs no title. Clara stood at the back of the crowd, coffee cooling in her hand, not stepping forward, not claiming the recognition. But when Morales spotted her and whispered her code name under his breath, others repeated it, and soon the crowd hummed with it, soft but steady. Obsidian Glass, Obsidian Glass. Later that evening, when the compound had quieted, Clara left a note folded neatly inside the booth at the west gate. It read, silence is not absence. It is vigilance. Carry it forward. And the next morning, the booth was empty, her jacket gone, her boots no longer by the door. Some said she had been reassigned. Others believed she walked away on her own terms. But every cadet, every officer, knew she hadn't disappeared. She had passed the torch, the way legends do, not with applause but with absence that teaches more than presence ever could. And when new recruits arrived, they were told the story, not through a lecture, not through a slideshow, but by walking the perimeter at dawn, alone, in silence, where the wind whispered against the fence and the ground remembered the weight of boots that once carried the name Obsidian Glass.